On the 30th of August, in 1963, the red-hot phone was hooked up between the Kremlin and the White House, and 3 months later, JFK was murdered on home movie film. In February of 1971, a teletype operator put the wrong tape into his machine at NORAD and sent a World War III warning out to the AP and the UPI and to 2,500 radio stations, and some stations went off the air, but most didn't even notice the warning until the alert was stopped 40 minutes later, after which NORAD lost permission to run their weekly warning tests. On the 14th of May in 1974, a private company produced the first laser-controlled fusion reaction in their laboratory, but there would be no nuclear energy if the oil companies had anything to say about the matter. Petroleum had been called rock oil because it oozed out of the ground, and American Indians had been using it to patch their canoes. And in 1859, Americans had begun refining oil in Pennsylvania. Kerosene from rock oil made a great flame, while gasoline was still a useless byproduct of manufacturing kerosene, and whale oil had become too expensive for ordinary people to use in their lamps because whales were becoming scarce. John D. Rockefeller became rich selling kerosene in America that brought light to the night and allowed factories to work overtime. And Rockefeller's company was called Standard Oil, and if anyone tried to sell kerosene and later gasoline, Standard could lower the price in that region and starve out the competition. Rockefeller had been born in New York, and his father had been a Patton medicine salesman, and the family had moved to Cleveland, and by 1879, Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil refining industry and all the oil pipelines by 1884. The Sherman Antitrust Act broke up Rockefeller's monopoly in 1890, and Rockefeller diversified when the Supreme Court dropped the final hammer on Standard Oil in 1911. Standard New Jersey became Exxon, and Standard New York became Mobil, and Standard California became Chevron, and Standard Ohio became Sohio, and Standard Indiana became Amoco, and in other mergers, Continental Oil became Conoco, and Atlantic Oil became Arco, and BP and Exxon would spend the rest of the century buying up most of the outstanding oil companies. A Jewish Englishman named Samuel bought the struggling Dutch petroleum company in Sumatra, in the Dutch East Indies, with a loan from the French Rothschilds, and he called it Dutch Shell, because his father had sold little boxes he made out of seashells bought from English sailors, and because it was a British oil company, the King of Holland called it Royal Dutch Shell. The Samuel family had come from Bavaria and moved to Holland, and then Samuel moved his family to the busy, dirty part of London, and Samuel made a fortune selling guns to Japan in 1894 to keep out the British, and Samuel had the help of Scottish merchants who were living as guests in Japan. Samuel was successful because people remembered his father's little shell boxes, and they also recognized Samuel as an honest businessman, and the Dutch Shell Board issued only special stock, giving control of the board strictly to stockholders, and Dutch Shell stocks could be purchased only by invitation, while their managers were given a healthy share of the profits. Samuel had gotten permission to take his Dutch Shell tankers through the Suez Canal in 1892, even though the British tried to stop him by saying that the tankers might blow up. And all Samuel's ships were named after seashells in honor of his father. Dutch Shell went to Texas after the first big Texas oil gusher in 1901, and Shell became a distributor of fuel oil because Texas Petroleum made poor kerosene, and fuel oil had become all the rage because the Santa Fe Railroad was building oil-driven train engines. Some American oil companies did very well in Texas, and within a few years were fueling hundreds of trains driven by oil instead of by coal. The Nobel brothers had gone to Baku to get into the kerosene business in the 1870s. And the Nobel brothers were born in Sweden and had moved to St. Petersburg. And in 1878, Ludwig Nobel invented the first tanker ship that didn't capsize when the oil cargo sloshed around inside the ship. Ludwig Nobel's tankers would travel up and down the Volga River, supplying Mother Russia with kerosene refined from Baku oil. And the problem with Baku oil was that it was a long way away from the market outside Russia. Baku was on the coast of the landlocked Caspian Sea. So the French Rothschilds financed a railroad that went from Baku over the Caucasus Mountains to a port on the Black Sea, and the Nobel Rothschild Railroad from Baku was completed in 1883, and the Nobel brothers expanded their railroad in 1889. But it remained a difficult route, so they blasted a pipeline through the mountains with Alfred Nobel's dynamite. When Ludwig Nobel died of a heart attack on vacation in the French Riviera, the newspapers reported that Alfred had died instead of Ludwig, so Alfred started the yearly Nobel Prize so that people would remember him and notice that he was still alive. The Rothschilds were Jewish and had come from the poor part of Frankfurt, where they had opened a bank and gained a reputation for being fair and honest. And the name Rothschild came from their house in Germany that had a red shield, or a Rothschild. Rothschild was so successful that Frankfurt became the center of Europe's financial markets, and Germany honored Wilhelm Karl von Rothschild for being such a good banker by making him a baron. The German government opened the Frankfurter Bank in 1854, but managed it so poorly that all the Frankfurters sided unanimously with the Austrians against the Prussians in the War of 1866. And when the Austrians lost to the Prussians at Königgrätz, the new government made the Frankfurters suffer by naming Berlin the capital of Germany instead of Frankfurt, and Germany printed a new currency that left Frankfurt out in the cold. When Baron Rothschild died in the spring of 1901, he was the only Rothschild to have stayed in Frankfurt while his 4 brothers had gone off to England, Italy, France, and Vienna, and they'd taken their father's lessons about good banking with them. The Baron's father had been the one who had Prince William of Hesse-Kassel's money in his bank when the prince had run away from Napoleon, and Wellington's army had been trapped in Spain, so Mr. Rothschild had sent runners with gold to pay the English sailors threatening to mutiny because they hadn't been paid, and he also gave the Spanish peasants some gold to stop fighting so that Wellington could go back home to England safely. One of these runners from Rothschild's bank had come back with the news of the outcome of Waterloo before anyone else knew. And Rothschild could have made a killing at the stock market with that news because the market was betting Napoleon would win. But Rothschild shared the news of Napoleon's defeat with the British government instead, and for that he won prestige as his only reward. In the century before the Great War, the Italian, French, and Viennese Rothschilds loaned untold millions to 18 different governments, but only the British Rothschilds were still in the banking business after the Great War. And Baron Louis de Rothschild would be arrested by Himmler's Gestapo, and his family would be forced to pay $20 million in ransom to the Nazis, who called it a loan. In 1908, a British man from Australia had found oil in southern Iran and helped start the Anglo-Persian Iranian Oil Company after drilling down 1,200 feet. And the ancient Iranians had worshipped the seeping gas ignited by lightning and had built temples around the pillars of fire. Anglo-Persian was launched as a British military expedition in anticipation of the Great War, using British troops and government money with workers imported from India instead of using Iranian labor. And Anglo-Persian oil would later become British Petroleum. Rockefeller's Standard had opened a foreign office in London called Anglo-American Oil Company. And the British Rothschilds had started distribution companies in 1888 to sell Baku oil in England, and Standard's kerosene was sold in blue tin cans, and Dutch Shell sold their kerosene in big red tin cans. Transporting Dutch Shell oil through the Strait of Constantinople was becoming a problem. So Shell built a pipeline through Iran from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf to ship Dutch Shell oil from Russia. And by 1908, 2/3 of the world's oil came from Rockefeller's AA Standard, and the rest from Dutch Shell out of Russia's Baku oil fields on the Caspian, and a small amount came from the Dutch East Indies. Until the Great War, Britain had burned good Welsh coal in the Royal Navy's ships. And when they switched to burning oil in modern ships, they chose Iranian oil because Iran was right next door to India, where the British military were comfortably entrenched. The Germans were building ocean liners that ran on oil while the British were still shoveling coal into the furnaces of their ships, and Britain would start building battleships that ran on oil in 1912. Standard went global as a transnational but not an international company, while British Petroleum was operating internationally. And the British wanted to sell Persian oil to Germany rather than having the Germans buy it from Russia. The Welsh and Scottish coal miners had been striking for better wages when the Royal Navy switched to fuel oil instead of coal, and Churchill bought a controlling interest in Anglo-Persian oil, and his company was chosen to provide oil for the Royal Navy. And 1 week before the Great War broke out, the British government bought 51% of Anglo-Persian. Churchill had sailed to India with Mountbatten in search of oil because Standard California and Dutch Shell had been refusing to do business with Britain. And Churchill had contracted with Anglo-Persian in exchange for the British investing £20 million in the Persian oil fields in southern Iran, and no oil was ever found in the northern half of Iran that had once been one of the Russias in the days of Catherine the Great. England and America had almost gone to war in 1896 over Venezuelan oil, after Venezuela told the British they weren't welcome in South America anymore. But the British said that they owned British Guiana and sent gunboats to Venezuela, so America declared the Monroe Doctrine, saying that European countries who claimed any new territory in the Americas would be met with U.S. forces. Instead of getting oil from Venezuela, Britain turned its attention to the Suez Canal and fought the Sudan War that took 3 years and ended with the whole Nile Valley under the control of Britain. Anglo-Persian built a refinery at the muddy mouth of the Tigris-Euphrates in 1912, but it was a poor site with even worse construction, and things went badly for the British as the company used up all its capital. And the British government took over complete control of Anglo-Persian oil in May of 1914. 2 months before the Great War, Britain had sent troops into Arabia, and Russia had mobilized the following month to protect northern Iran from the British, and Austria mobilized to keep Trieste free of the British, and Germany mobilized to protect both Iraq and Turkey from the British, and England declared war on Germany. The Great War started with the British seizing all the known oil, and while Britain had only taken over a private company once before, when they bought the Suez Canal in 1875 with a low-interest loan from the English Rothschilds, Anglo-Persian oil was directly owned by the King of England in the Great War, while America was buying oil from Standard and Europe was buying from Dutch Shell. And as the Great War began, the British Crown also seized Dutch Shell's oil fields. Before the turn of the century, Russia had half the world's oil coming out of the Baku oil fields. And in 1914, the British claimed that Russia was mobilizing to take over the Persian oil in southern Iran and to also gain a warm water port, since all the northern ports in Russia were usually frozen solid. The Baku oil fields would be nationalized by the Communist Reds in 1920. And Jersey Standard would buy half of the Nobel brothers' oil rights 3 months later from Lenin, who was willing to do business with the Americans. And the war with the whites began, with the British landing in Baku. In the middle of October 1919, it appeared that Petrograd and Moscow might fall simultaneously to the whites, but within a few days the whole picture changed. Denikin, his troops outnumbered and extended over a 700-mile front from Kiev to Tsaritsyn, came to a halt. On October 20th, he lost Oriel, while to the east, Boudinny's cavalry recaptured Voronezh. The white collapse followed swiftly. On November 17th, Kursk was lost. General Maevsky, a confirmed wine drunkard who made little attempt to keep discipline among his troops, was replaced by Wrangel in the central sector, but it was already too late. The Communists beat their regular forces and successfully employed peasant partisans to harass the retreating White Army. 20th Century Russia by Donald W. Treadgold, Chicago, Rand McNally and Company, 1959, 1968, page 185. After Lenin prevailed in the war with the whites, Russia was offering cheaper oil than anyone else after the Americans had rebuilt the damaged oil works. And Britain tried to keep anyone from doing business with the Russians because they needed a monopoly in order to raise the price of oil. Thanks to Lawrence of Arabia, the British had become firmly entrenched in Arabia, and Britain had been ruling in both Kuwait and Bahrain using the local sheiks as puppets. A furloughed British soldier from New Zealand opened a drugstore in Aden and made a great deal of money starting up an oil company in Bahrain in 1925, and he was welcomed by the Arabs after striking a fresh water well while drilling for oil. The Saudis had given him permission to drill for oil in 1923, and he'd found oil on the Kuwait-Saudi border in 1924. And the soldier would visit Baghdad occasionally, which bothered the Anglo-Persian company because they wanted sole control in Iraq. But the Arabians liked the soldier very much indeed, and so did American Gulf, who agreed to work with him in developing oil in Bahrain and Kuwait. Gulf Oil had been started by the son of an Irishman named William Mellon when he made an oil strike near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Mellon built a pipeline from Port Arthur in Texas to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1907, which is why he named his company Gulf Oil. The Panama Canal was opened in 1913, just as Henry Ford struck oil on his California property. And during the Great War, Rockefeller's companies would sell enough products to Europe to pay all of America's previous debts. And after the Great War, all of Europe would owe money to America. There were 1 million cars and trucks burning gasoline in America before the Great War, and by 1923 over 80% of automobile drivers in the world were American. And while California only produced 1/4 of the world's oil, production exceeded demand, and more than enough oil was selling in the market that prices were continuing to drop worldwide. The oil companies built refineries on Dutch-held islands off the coast of Venezuela because there were hostile natives on the mainland. And Dutch Shell, Gulf Oil, and Pan American were shipping Venezuelan oil to the world after the Great War, second only to the oil coming from America. And Pan American would be bought by Standard Indiana. Venezuelan oil was cutting into everybody's profits, and to stay in business, a company needed to make a profit. And in 1926, Dutch Shell and Mobil were fighting over the oil market in India, so a market-fixing agreement was signed among the major oil companies in the summer of 1928 that they called the Red Line Agreement, and they signed because monopoly price control was no longer possible with so many suppliers. Russian, Romanian, and Venezuelan oil were ruining prices, so their only choice was to either enlarge market demand by creating more uses for oil or limit the supply, and both would fail because the market was still free. A man named Gulbenkian, who was an Armenian living in Turkey, had taken a red pencil in 1928 and drawn a line around what had been the Ottoman Empire before the Great War. And the Red Line Agreement included Gulf oil and Turkish petroleum. And the Red Line meant that when a country such as Mexico owed loan payments to foreign governments, the government that had loaned them money would defend that country against any attempt to take over their oil fields. Iran and Kuwait were outside the Red Line, because the British already had a military presence in their Persian and Arabian wells, and they claimed not to need any help defending their own facilities. The Red Line Agreement was between four parties: the British, the French, Dutch Shell, and the Americans, with Gulbenkian holding 5%. And it was basically a military contract which Gulbenkian hoped would prevent more tribal warfare in his homeland after the horror of the Turks having massacred most of his kinsmen in Armenia. Because Kuwait was outside the Red Line, Gulf Oil sent the furloughed English soldier to Standard, California, to set up a Canadian subsidiary of SoCal that would sell Arabian oil outside the Red Line, and it was called Bahrain Petroleum. And the British government reminded the Arabians that a pact had been signed between the Arabians and the British before the Great War that said Arabia would not allow any Germans into their territory, and it had a British nationality clause that excluded Americans as well, so California was not allowed to market Kuwaiti oil using the Canadian company. Arabian oil production had been cut back in protest of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 that gave Zionists permission to buy land in Palestine from the Arabs. And the Balfour Declaration had been a personal favor to a man who had helped Britain not lose the Great War. The Arab protest had created an oil scarcity in 1920, and prices had skyrocketed, which filled Britain's depleted treasury and prompted America and Germany to consider alternatives to petroleum such as synthetic oil. With clear memory of the oil shortages of 1920, Exxon and American Mobil bought 1/4 of the shares in the Iraq Petroleum Company, while BP, Dutch Shell, and a French company each held an equal share of the balance, and these would be the signers of the Red Line Agreement in 1928. The British were threatening military action over the Canadian subsidiaries' oil operations, and when the Arabians objected, the British changed their minds in 1929, saying that American money would be useful in constructing all the buildings and equipment needed to get oil out of the ground in Arabia. With the October crash in 1929, capital needed to invest in drilling for oil dried up. So Anglo-Persian renegotiated with Gulf, and the new pact specified that a British agent be allowed to read all the Americans' mail. The Red Line contract had been signed on the 31st of July in 1928, and it was an agreement to share and share alike all costs and conditions of the marketing of oil within the Red Line. And the following day, the British reneged on the Red Line because they wanted to exclude the French. In its place, the Brits called the Achnacarry Castle meeting Achnacarry Castle meeting in Scotland within the month, where BP and Shell and Exxon executives met for some grouse shooting to carve up the rest of the world, agreeing that markets would remain quote-unquote as is, and terminate all competition outside the Red Line. The conspiracy was that oil would be supplied to neutrals from the nearest geographical source, and supply would be increased only in response to global demand, which meant quotas and shared percentages, and the Russians were not invited, but were offered a share of Britain's market. Russia needed money to modernize and was selling oil to pay for it, and the American market was also excluded because America was so far away and had its own supply. And Acnicary said that smaller companies could still sell oil at lower prices to get market share until the big companies moved against them. In order to avoid U.S. antitrust laws as well as escape being detected as red line contract breakers, none of the grousers actually signed the new contract. And the Acnicary Pact would last until Hitler's war, after which all bets were off. The Acnicary conspiracy included Anglo-Persian, Dutch Shell, Gulf Melon, Standard Indiana, and Standard New Jersey, parenthesis, and their man in Germany, close parenthesis, and excluded the French. And as soon as President Hoover heard about the Acnicary conspiracy to control the oil market, he ordered the Federal Reserve to cut off loans to the participating oil companies, and the unavoidable consequence was that before the end of the year, the American banks ran out of money to keep the stock market bubble going. Romania refused to go along with any agreement and was pumping more than their share of oil, and Venezuela was also still ruining prices. But the main problem with both the Red Line and Acnicary was the continuing supply of cheaper Russian oil. And just as the American stock market was beginning to recover in 1930, there was a sudden oil surplus from British oil in Arabia that drove down the price and cut off any American oil company profits, and the British claimed the oil surplus of 1930 was an attempt to raise some cash to meet their debt payments to America from their Lend-Lease debt from the Great War. To add to the burgeoning market, oil was struck in East Texas by a wildcatter who had spent only 7 weeks of his life attending school, and gasoline became so cheap that filling stations gave away food with every purchase. East Texas oil challenged even the price of Russian oil, and there was no way to cut back production. So on the 31st of August in 1931, the governor of Texas sent in the National Guard to stop wildcatting, and the Texas National Guard rode in on several thousand horses because the roads were too muddy for cars. Southern California was now called Bahrain Petroleum, and they began drilling in Arabia in the fall of 1931, and the following May they hit oil. And in order to keep cheap foreign oil out, the U.S. put a tariff on importing overseas oil in 1932 at 20 cents per barrel for crude and $1 per barrel for gasoline. Venezuelan oil was hit hard, and with the new tariffs and government intervention to keep oil companies from going bust, which would stop the supply of oil altogether, the days of 10 cents a barrel Texas crude were over. And when FDR was elected president, 1/3 of all the oil companies in the world were American. The Kuwait Oil Company started in 1933 with a 50-50 agreement between American Gulf and Anglo-Persian. And Dutch Shell was put in Anglo-Persian's place, and the Arab king had played them off against each other to drive up the price. The British oil companies in Kuwait and Bahrain complained that the Americans were not taxed at the same heavy rate they were suffering from the British government, so the Americans offered a compromise in April of 1933 to sell Arabian oil at a fixed price on top of a large yearly fee, and the pact would later be extended from 1961 to 1993, after which Kuwait would be free to buy out either company. Acnicary was tried again in 1932 and then again in 1934, and they went so far as to limit advertising and stopped free gas station giveaway gifts, and they quit handing out calendars and letter openers and lighters and pens with specific oil company logos. But these efforts to control the market failed in America as prices continued to fall. Meanwhile, Samuel had expanded his operations to Mexico, where another British company was also drilling for oil, and the largest Mexican oil company was called Mexican Eagle, and was managed by Samuel's Dutch Shell. and the Mexicans claimed that the Mexican Constitution of 1917 said that the Mexican government owned all the oil under the ground. President Wilson had threatened military action to protect the oil companies in Mexico because he wanted Mexico to sell oil to America no matter who sold it, and the U.S. also needed to protect the Panama Canal. When Anglo-Persian pulled out of Kuwaiti oil, Dutch Shell moved into the Eastern American market that violated Standard's territory, and Anglo-Persian moved into Mexico, where inflammatory anti-American language used by the British failed to take hold with Mexicans, since so many of their relatives were employed in the States and regularly sent money back home to Mexico. The U.S. managed to control its domestic oil market with FDR's New Deal after 1934, and FDR declared that smuggled oil would no longer be allowed to bring down prices, and Senator Tom Connally of Texas passed the Hot Oil Act in 1935, but this price fixing failed because it encouraged overproduction. And then the Supreme Court declared most of FDR's Recovery Act unconstitutional, but Connally's hot oil legislation survived, along with the working operations between the feds and the state of Texas. Quotas were suggested by the Bureau of Mines that were mostly adhered to out of self-interest, and FDR sent federal inspectors into Texas because Texas was too poor to police itself. Germany was cooperating with the Red Line in 1935. And when the Nazis took over a chain of Russian gas stations in Germany to stop them from selling gas at a lower price, Russia stopped delivering gas to those stations, and by this time, Russia had been completely frozen out of both the Red Line and Achnacarry, but the Soviets had become industrialized enough to soak up their share of their own oil, so things went well enough. Until the beginning of 1938, when Standard New Jersey announced it would end the Achnacarry Pact, and World War II would break out the following year. FDR's New Deal had been friendly towards Mexico, but Mexico took notice of Standard going it alone, and Mexico took over the oil fields by nationalization in 1938, kicking out the Americans along with the British, so Britain called for an embargo of Mexican oil to keep it from flattening prices, but Germany and Italy refused to honor the embargo on Mexican oil, and Japan joined in as a third big customer, planning to build an oil pipeline from the Mexican oil fields to the Pacific Ocean. If Britain went to war with Italy or Germany or Japan over oil prices, U.S. neutrality laws would stop American companies from selling oil to the Royal Navy. And if Romania and Iraq were conquered by either Germany or Russia, and the Dutch East Indies taken over by Japan, Mexican oil would be critical to Britain's war effort. FDR tried to keep reports of U-boats seen in the Gulf of Mexico secret because he wanted Germany to have access to the oil market, what with the neutrality and all. But British newspapers were reporting the U-boat sightings as being a threat to America in hopes that the U.S. would come in on Britain's side. American Standard and I.G. Farben decided that by 1929, 1/5 of all oil used in Germany would be synthetic, which meant it would be made from coal. And the man who'd invented synthetic oil and the chairman of I.G. Farben shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1931. Hitler visited the company in 1932 and said he would give them a government contract for synthetic oil, and I.G. Farben contributed money to Hitler's campaign. Coal tar had been used to make the first synthetic dye thanks to Bill Perkins' work in London in 1856. And coal tar had been a toxic byproduct of the steel industry, but was now worth a great deal. Until synthetic dye, the beautiful scarlet color worn by cardinals, was a precious commodity made from the ink sac of certain snails, and thanks to Perkin, any ordinary person could now wear cardinals' colors. Coal tar dye also made it possible to read books without the coloring of hardback bindings coming off onto damp hands. And the British failed to capitalize on the discovery of synthetic dye, but the Germans ran with it. And coal tar was also used to make incredible pharmaceutical products and a myriad of other useful chemicals, and Bayer built an aspirin and dye factory in New York in 1903 to get around U.S. tariff laws. Polyethylene was created from oil in 1933, and nylon was invented in 1934, just in time to make parachutes. And the Nazis had control of IG Farben by 1938, and within 2 years, Germany was producing 70,000 barrels of synthetic oil per day. There had been a glut in the oil market in 1931, while a barrel of synthetic oil was selling for 10 times the price of Mexican oil. And with the Depression, the price of oil fell, and so did the price of rubber, so Standard and IG Farben stopped working together on the synthetic Buna process, while the synthetic oil and rubber plant at Auschwitz continued working on its own, with production at Auschwitz using as much electricity as the entire city of Berlin. IG Farben held the patent on synthetic oil from 1926, and when the Luna Works needed financial partners, Britain had not been interested in supporting any work on synthetic oil, while American Standard New Jersey had wanted to help the German IG Farben, and Hitler would later force the Jewish synthetic oil inventor out of Germany. The British were more interested in their control of Persian and Arabian oil than in pursuing synthetic oil. And Iranians were not Arabs, but had come from southern Russia and were known as the original Aryans. Iran had once been called Elam and would be called Persia until Shah Reza changed the name to Iran when Hitler became successful, so it would sound more like a country of Aryans, because they were the white people of the Muslim world, since their ethnic origin was Russian, and the name Anglo-Persian would be changed to Anglo-Iranian oil. In the 30s, the Shah was being paid peanuts from Anglo-Persian and was having to import oil from Russia for use in Iran, and Shah Reza tried to cancel his agreement with Anglo-Persia in November of 1932, because the Depression had caused prices to fall too far, so the British stirred up the Muslims to oust the Shah. And 6 months later, the Shah's original agreement with Anglo-Persian was resumed exactly as it had been before the Islamic troubles. Iran's Cyrus the Great had been the world's first emperor, and he had conquered much of the known world in the 6th century BC. And Darius, the King of Kings, in the 5th century BC, built 1,700 miles of road with paved stones on which 4-horse chariots could travel. And Darius, the King of Kings, dug a waterway between the Nile River and the Red Sea that would later become the Suez Canal. The Iranians were all forced to become Muslims when the Islamic Arabs invaded Iran 1,000 years later. And the Muslim Arabs would never forgive Iran for their Cyrus the Great having freed 40,000 Jews held captive in Babylon, along with Cyrus helping the Jews to build their second temple in Jerusalem. To keep themselves separate from the barbarian Arabs, the Iranians invented Shiite Islam to oppose Sunni Islam, and Genghis Khan would take over the whole of Iran for 100 years in the 13th century, after which Shiite rulers would keep the Sunni Ottoman Turks out of Iran until Turkey's defeat in the Great War. Russia lost interest in Iran when the Russians were busy with the Red Revolution during the Great War, followed by the war with the Whites. And Shah Reza's father had made friends with Lenin after the British used Iran as a staging platform to attack Russia in the war with the Whites. With Russia weakened, Britain was able to gain influence over Iran, and they put Shah Reza on the throne. in 1926 to keep out the Russians. Iran pushed back with the help of the French, but were unable to prevent the British from having a civilizing influence over the Sun throne. And Shah Reza stopped the Shiites from flagellating themselves and invented a new hat for his soldiers that had a brim instead of the Moslem beret they wore for touching their foreheads to the ground. Shah Reza let girls into school and sent his son to school in Geneva, and he raised the age of marriage from 9 to 15, and he passed a law that men had to tell their brides how many wives they already had. Shah Reza built factories and schools and roads and brought modernity to Iran, and he built a railroad from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea that had 4,000 bridges and 224 tunnels, and Shah Reza made the trains run on time. Many Germans were living in Iran in 1935 because the Shah had bought German machinery and paid German technicians to modernize his country. And Shah Reza was a friend of Hitler, and although the training of the Shah's army had come from France, many Iranians had gone to school in Germany. In August of 1941, 2 months after Barbarossa kicked off, the British Navy sailed up the Persian Gulf from Kuwait and sank Iran's navy. In response, the Russians landed soldiers in the north, while the British forced Shah Reza to abdicate in favor of his son, and Shah Reza sailed for Johannesburg, where he would die in 1944. Churchill refused to use the name Iran, but insisted it was still Persia, and Churchill claimed the new name was too near the name Iraq to be useful or acceptable. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans arrived in Iran to use Shah Reza's railroad for shipping supplies to Russia, because the convoys bringing Lend-Lease to the ports of Vladivostok and Murmansk were having trouble getting through. Many more Russians arrived in Iran, moving into the ports on the Caspian Sea to help unload Lend-Lease supplies, and FDR sent 30,000 Americans into Iran to ensure that the supplies got through to the motherland. The Americans brought diesel engines built by the American Locomotive Company to replace the Iranian steam trains, along with 3,000 pieces of rolling stock for carrying tonnage up the railroad through Iran. Along with all the Lend-Lease dropped off along the way to the Iranians and the British, the Americans expanded Iran's factories and roads and schools and made improvements to hospitals and to government administration, and they also built irrigation systems for the farmers. The American presence made it less likely that either the British or the Russians would have power over Iran after the war, and America supplied, quote, $10 million to Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf, former head of the New Jersey State Police, who was in charge of training the Imperial Iranian Gendarmerie, close quote. Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carol Quigley, New York, Macmillan, 1966, page 1059. Schwarzkopf spoke German because his parents had come from Germany, and that gave him an advantage in communicating with the Persians. And Schwarzkopf had been gassed during the Great War, and was made an MP guarding German POWs, where he got to practice his spoken German. After the war, he was made the first head of the state police, where he used motorcycles to chase criminals on the paved roads and horses to chase them through the woods. And Ike would send him to Iran after Hitler's war to teach them how to police themselves so they could keep control of their own oil. Hitler's non-aggression pact with Stalin in 1939 allowed Russia to sell oil to Germany, and Romania had the most significant oil fields in Europe and had suffered mightily during the Great War, hoping to stay neutral while the British destroyed the Romanian oil wells to keep them out of Germany's hands. Romania was given a serious beating, and the Germans repaired the Romanian oil facilities before the Great War was over. And in June of 1940, Stalin went into Romania because the non-aggression pact made with Hitler had given Romania to Stalin. Hitler had planned to stay friends with Russia so he could buy all the oil Germany needed from Stalin. And the non-aggression pact split Poland between Germany and Russia, and both sides thought it had been agreed upon in London with the Chamberlain deal. The division of Poland had gone rather smoothly, with the nationalist Poles retreating into Romania to wait for help from the British, which never came. The Germans and the Russians greeted each other as friends when they met in the middle of Poland, and they took plenty of photographs of their armies fraternizing and working together, and the nationalist Poles went off to France and to England to become Dominion troops. Romania was a stunningly beautiful country full of fairy tale castles, just a little smaller than the state of Colorado. And the non-aggression pact went awry when Romania and Russia had a falling out over the Jewish question. Romania invited the Germans to protect them from Russia in November of 1940. And by December, Hitler started planning Barbarossa, not only to retain the Romanian oil fields, but to protect Baku as well, now that it had become clear that Stalin was more interested in protecting Jews than in selling oil. Because the Romanians lost so much in overturning the agreement with Stalin, they went to great lengths to persecute Jews to prove that the Soviets had it all wrong about the menace they posed, becoming a tragic chapter in Romanian history, having been burned too closely by the scourge of Islam on their southern border, and Romania would become one of the Russian Soviets for their pains. To beat Russia in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler had to make it a surprise attack, or the Russians would have time to set up defenses. And a loyal German communists went to Stalin and warned him about Barbarossa, but Stalin had him shot because it seemed like a trick. When I worked in Baku, there were rumors rampant that during the occupation of Baku by English troops, Beria worked for the counterintelligence service of the Musavat government. Since the Musavat counterintelligence service was under the control of English, it was said that Beria must be an English intelligence agent operating through the Musavatists. Khrushchev remembers, page 100. Stalin took 250,000 prisoners out of Poland by railroad to Smolensk in September of 1939, all those unwilling to surrender to the new Soviet regime. And he offered to send them to Hitler, but instead, Hitler sent execution squads to the Katyn forest in April and May of 1940 to show Stalin how it was done, and the Germans and Russians lined up anyone who could speak English and shot them dead, whether or not they had a good excuse. Stalin had been using Polish prisoners as construction workers when the Germans showed up at Smolensk and murdered 12,000 of the Poles being held prisoner. And they were killed mostly by German guns, along with a few Russian pistols that were found when the site was excavated. And the Germans dug up the dead Poles after Barbarossa to point an accusatory finger at Stalin, hoping to prove to the world that Russians were barbarians and that everyone should support the Nazis. As soon as the Russians won at Stalingrad in February of 1943, the Red Cross opened an inquiry the following month of April to investigate the Katyn massacre, and Stalin accused the Allies of collaborating with German propaganda, and he wanted to know why Russia was the only one doing any serious fighting against Hitler. Stalin had been asking why Hitler hadn't managed to conquer Britain in 1940, and then Hitler betrayed him with Barbarossa. And to get to the Romanian and Russian oil fields during Barbarossa, 3 million German soldiers drove more than 500,000 oil-burning vehicles along with 500,000 horses into Russia on the 22nd of June in 1941. And the German troops didn't reach Moscow until the fall of 1941, and then they bogged down in the mud and the snow on their way to Baku. Because the Japanese had gone after Southeast Asia instead of Vladivostok on the Pacific, Stalin had been able to bring his eastern troops over to fight Hitler, and so the German attack on Russia had failed. Yet if Germany had conquered Russia and negotiated a peace with Britain, the Polish and Romanian and Baku oil fields would have been shared by Britain and Germany, and together they could have stopped Russian and American oil from interfering in the market. But the Japanese had not attacked Russia in order to concentrate on beating the Americans in the Pacific theater. Armies ran on rubber and motor parts and gasoline. And when German trucks broke down, they needed spare parts that could not be delivered over the few roads fit for motor vehicles in Russia. And the German tanks and trucks burned more gasoline, getting over roads made of Russian mud than the Germans had allocated. Germany needed to reach Baku, but the Americans had been supplying Stalin with enough supplies to beat back the Germans, and Russia was able to win at Stalingrad in January of 1943. In January of 1942, a squad of British commandos had gone into the Dutch East Indies and blown up Dutch Shell's oil wells and their related facilities, and the commandos warned the Dutch workers to flee for their lives the day before the Japanese arrived to occupy the island that had just been abandoned by the meager British military presence. Some of the Dutch oil workers were evacuated by seaplane to Surabaya, but 40 of them died hiding in the jungle from the Japanese, while another 35 were captured and caged. And the Americans cut the Japanese oil supply routes because Japan suffered a gasoline shortage. So their use of suicide attacks saved fuel because each suicide required only half the gasoline to complete its mission. Stalin attacked the Germans at the Romanian Ploiești oil fields in the summer of 1942 after the Allies had bombed it in June and bombed it again the following year. And hundreds of downed pilots were rescued in Yugoslavia and sheltered by the nationalist Chetnik Draza Mikhailovich. Bombing the Ploiești oil fields had done some damage, but the facility had such an enormous output that only half of the installation was even being used. So the Germans simply put the other half to work, and 8 million Russian soldiers would die that year in 1942. Russian trucks ran on diesel, while German trucks ran on gasoline. So captured Russian troop transports were of no help to Hitler. And when Field Marshal von Manstein called Hitler for help at Stalingrad, there was no help coming, and while there were plenty of supplies and aircraft available, there was not enough gasoline to get it to Stalingrad, and by the time Hitler gave the order to retreat, German troops no longer had enough fuel to even get through the Russian lines, and so the German army surrendered. At the height of the summer of 1942, German mountaineering soldiers had run the swastika flag up a pole planted on the highest peak in the Caucasus Mountains near Chechnya. That was only a few hundred miles from Baku. And Germany captured one small Caucasian oil field by the end of the summer. But the pump houses had been so completely damaged that less than 100 barrels per day could be produced, and when they finally repaired the wells, it would be too late to make much of a difference. The new German radio phones had worked to perfection in Russia, and Hitler knew he could get all the gasoline he needed for the war from Romania, where the Danube River ran from its outlet on the Black Sea in Romania all the way to Vienna for carrying tanker barge traffic. And when Hitler needed to withdraw from North Africa to bolster his drive towards Baku, Rommel disobeyed Hitler because he was fighting the war on his own, and the Americans had gotten in the way of the British in Iran. And after Stalingrad was won by the Russians in January of 1943, the tide of the war turned against both the Germans and the British. Rommel had his gasoline rationed until the fall of 1941, and well into early 1942, when supplies had mysteriously reappeared. And Rommel had pushed on into Africa until he was a Sunday's drive away from the Suez Canal. Mussolini had been deeply disappointed when Rommel was sent back to France, because Mussolini had put a white horse on a plane so he could ride victorious through the streets of Cairo, while Rommel marched on towards the Holy Land and then continued on to the oil fields of Iraq and Saudi Arabia. However, Rommel's supply line in Africa had been so long that his trucks were consuming more gas than they could carry, and the British had been sinking all his ships coming through the Mediterranean that were bringing fuel to Rommel, but still Rommel insisted that he could beat the British in North Africa despite Hitler's orders to the contrary. Rommel was running short of gasoline again by the summer of 1942. And the Luftwaffe was failing to protect him, and the German army had become suspicious and demoralized by the lack of Luftwaffe support. And the German soldier thought that surrendering to the Americans would be the better bet. Monty had been leaving fuel dumps cached in the desert sands, paid for with his American Lend-Lease funds that he had no intention of ever paying back. And then came the Kasserine Pass business, and by May of 1943, all of Rommel's African Corps had surrendered. Algiers, Thursday, February 18, 1943. Alex ventured the firm opinion that the Hun in the present drive, which had been tough and has cost the Americans at least 80 tanks today, was headed for Tebessa. I told him General Anderson had been influenced not to send reserves to Fredendall because of interceptive enemy radio messages, that this was to be merely a diversionary move and that the real one was coming farther north. So the information proved to be wrong and made me wonder if we've been listening to something the Germans have purposely been using to build us up for a grand letdown at deception. Alex was afraid our units had been dispersed too much and that the Hun would gobble them up one by one about what is happening. Said he thought it would be best to give Anderson one section, as the long front is too much for one man to handle, give Fredendall a part, and then there would be Montgomery coming along from Tripoli. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 264 and 5. Algiers, Wednesday, February 17, 1943. We have taken a severe licking in the battle for Sidi Bouzid in central Tunisia. Ike fears we have lost as many as 4,000 or 5,000 men and considerable equipment. My 3 years with Eisenhower. The personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 263. In 1940, only 5% of the world's oil had come from the Persian Gulf, and over 60% came from America. And that year, selected oil wells in Arabia had been filled with cement under supervision of American and British companies, and that year in 1940, a drought and crop failure cut back the Muslim pilgrimage to Arabia, so the Saudi king was strapped for cash, and that he usually collected from Islamic tourism. But America would not give him Lend-Lease money because Saudi Arabia was not a democracy as required by U.S. law for Lend-Lease. The British had minted $2 million worth of Arab coins for use in Arabia and had given it to some royal Arab families. ingenious economic dodges of the Treasury, plus judicious purchases under enemy noses in neutral markets, and the daily tightening of the stranglehold blockade, were rapidly putting Germany in the same spot in which she found herself in 1916, after only 7 months of war this time! Indeed, it was all wise, cagey, methodical. The first week of the war they formed the United Kingdom Oil Pool, assembling all British oil companies under one government department. Good idea, so far. But then they began to organize the department. The English have no gift for organization. Committees were named to organize the committee that ran the pool. Subcommittees were appointed to organize the organizing committees, and steering committees were appointed over them. Result: in March, in the Mediterranean, one oil tanker often received from London 3 sets of orders to report to 3 different ports for 3 different types of cargo. Europe in the Spring, page 142. The U.S. had kept a careful eye on Arabian countries after the Great War, when the British had made their peace with the Kaiser. The U.S. had kept a careful eye on Arabian countries after the Great War, when the British had made their peace with the Kaiser. And FDR knew that Arabian oil would determine who won Hitler's war. And he reminded all the Arabians that the money the British were spending had actually come from American Lend-Lease. FDR knew that American tankers would soon be busy supplying ships in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, and he needed to stay on the best terms with the Saudis. And FDR signed Lend-Lease with the Saudis on the 18th of February in 1943, bending the rules of the Monroe Doctrine due to the presence of the British military in Arabia, and because Germany was in occupation of the Romanian oil fields. Then came the destruction of the troop ship Rona in the Mediterranean, and the Rona was hit on the 26th of November in 1943 by a radio-guided, rocket-boosted glide bomb, killing over 1,000 American troops on board. And it was reported that the ship had been hit with a torpedo from a submarine because the glide bombs were simply too terrifying for their existence to become known. 2 days after the sinking of the Rona, FDR opened the Tehran Conference in Iran because Stalin felt comfortable in Tehran, and FDR gave Churchill a really bad time for the duration. Stalin visited the Shah at Tehran, but FDR made the Shah come to him. And FDR told the Shah he would help him plant trees to bring forests back to Iran. Iran used to have large forests. 11th century travelers wrote about them, but the forests' private owners cut them down, mostly for charcoal to be used in cooking and heating and smoking opium in a hookah. Fall of the Peacock Throne, The Story of Iran by William H. Forbes, New York, Harper and Row, 1980, page 73. When FDR called Stalin and Churchill to the Yalta Conference in the Crimea on the 13th and 14th of February in 1945, the Chinese Chang had not been invited, and the question of Poland dominated the negotiations. FDR told Churchill that the only way to stop the Russians from taking over the whole of Poland was if Germany surrendered unconditionally, which had not been forthcoming because Hitler was putting his hopes on the British plan for a separate peace, which Himmler also had been trying to achieve, and the Americans were having none of it. From the 16th of December in 1944, Stalin had been waiting on the other side of the Vistula to see how the Bulge would come out, and he had held his soldiers back in case the Bulge was successful and the British and the Germans joined together to occupy Hitler's half of Poland. On the 12th of January, when Stalin started his offensive towards Berlin, he would move 200 miles in 11 days, and Hitler responded by sending Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army to Budapest to protect the Hungarian oil fields in Operation Spring Awakening. Regardless of the prospective destiny of the 6th Panzer Army, The regular soldier on the Western Front regarded its withdrawal as preferential treatment for the SS. Manteuffel reported that his situation was not so serious where the troops were busy, but in the rest areas the hopelessness of the entire operation was now obvious. The Bitter Woods, page 425. The British wanted to give Poland back to a Polish government in exile waiting in London. And the Romanians had arrested the real Polish government that had fled to safety in northern Romania in September of 1939, where they had waited in vain for the French and British army. But FDR wanted Stalin to know that America would oppose the British being let back into Poland. And at Yalta, FDR was quite rude to Churchill about it. On his way back from the Yalta conference, FDR met with King Saud on board a ship in the Suez Canal, and they met on Valentine's Day. And FDR and King Saud became fast friends because both were the same age and both had infirm legs. And FDR gave King Saud his spare wheelchair even though the king was too big to sit in it. King Saud wanted two things. First, that the British be kept out of Arabia, and second, that the displaced Jews be given a homeland in Germany. 3 days later, Churchill rushed down to talk with King Saud, but refused to refrain from drinking alcohol in the king's presence, and Churchill smoked cigars constantly in front of him, and while FDR was a chain smoker himself, the American president had refrained from smoking in the presence of the Saudi king. FDR would die without putting his pact with King Saud into writing, yet Congress continued to refuse to do oil business with the British, not so much to comply with FDR's promises to King Saud, but because America could not enter into any state petroleum arrangement, as America was bound to the principle of fair competition in a free private market as far as Arabian oil was concerned. The Russians had once owned most of the Pacific Northwest in America all the way down to the Presidio in San Francisco. And after the first United Nations conference opened in April of 1945 in San Francisco, the first complaint to the UN came from Iran in January of 1946, who claimed that the Russians were still in Iran's northern region, quote, which had been occupied in wartime for the purpose of ensuring the supply line from the Persian Gulf, close quote. 20th Century Russia, page 414. The UN sided with Iran, but granted Russia their request that Israel be allowed to found a state of their own, and without Russia's vote, there would have been no state of Israel. The second complaint to the United Nations was that most Greeks had failed to vote in the 1946 election in Greece because they wanted Russia to help squash the Islamists continuing to torment them. And the new American president declared the Truman Doctrine in April of 1947, saying that America would come to the aid of free countries threatened by, quote, armed minorities or outside pressures, close quote, while the Russians wanted to stay in Iran to help the Shah with his Islamic terrorism problem. All the foreign forces were supposed to leave Iran within 6 months of the end of Hitler's war, but the British complained they should be allowed to stay in Iran if the Russians were still in the north. So to get the British out of Iran, Truman told Stalin to leave Iran or the American army would come land in the Persian Gulf, and the Russians withdrew from Iran, but the British stayed. There was a huge demand for gasoline after Hitler's war, and more oil was discovered with new drilling technology, but demand continued to be greater than supply, and King Saud refused to allow anyone but Americans to pump Saudi oil.